Hey there guys, this is Richard, your host, with another marvelous video. What comes to your mind when I say the words horror games? Some of you will think of Outlast, while the adventurous ones might think of Amnesia. But all of you veterans will undoubtedly think of the iconic Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil was a game that contributed to establishing the horror genre in video games, paving the way for numerous more spine-chilling titles. In many ways, many of these games can even be considered its clones. With the first game's release in 1996, many games drew cues from it and created games with similar characteristics. It could be interesting to revisit some of these games out of curiosity, and who knows, maybe a couple of them are even better than the original. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin.
Two dogs! Stop, Two Dog!
Days Gone, 2019. If you're a devotee of video games set in the post-apocalyptic world, you've probably heard of Sony's Days Gone, the famous 2019 action-adventure video game. This game is on our list because of the fans of the newer Resident Evil games like Resident Evil 4 and 6. The players who believed Resident Evil 6's magnanimous action didn't feel quite enough because of the segregation of story modes should be satisfied with Days Gone due to the open-world scenario, where they may combat a swarm of frenzied zombies without interruption. Days Gone recounts the narrative of an individual named Deacon St. John, an ex-member of a biker gang. The game is set in the post-apocalyptic state of Oregon, in the US, a couple of years after a worldwide pandemic had hit, while Deacon embarked on a journey to reunite with his wife Sarah upon learning that she could still be alive. It's a third-person game with beautiful graphics, showcasing many locations inspired by real places in Oregon. On his journey, the player must fight human adversaries and infected entities known as Freakers. However, not to worry, Deacon is skilled in several fighting styles, including stealth and the use of different weaponry. One of the game's key components is Deacon's drifter bike, which serves as his primary mode of transport and a portable inventory. Days Gone, as previously said, integrates many of the shooting features found in the more recent Resident Evil games and adds a meaningful narrative and a large open environment. It has a detailed advancement system, many quests, and a complicated crafting mechanism, making it seem like a survival game at its core. In short, Days Gone is a must-try. Silent Hill games franchise. This list would have made no sense without including the Silent Hill games. At its peak, the Silent Hill franchise was viewed as the ultimate counterpart to the Resident Evil games. It provided a creepier alternative to the latter's more action-oriented style. Both were released at roughly the same time on the original PlayStation and stretched the technology to its boundaries. Silent Hill's gameplay is very similar to that of the early Resident Evil games, enabling players to halt and fire their enemies with a range of weaponry to choose from. However, both games are fundamentally distinct in numerous ways. Silent Hill is primarily concerned with the psychological horror genre and a severe lack of fighting, while Resident Evil has undergone several structural gameplay changes, yet began as a survival horror. The creatures in Silent Hill are unpleasant. While zombies and other enemies in the Resident Evil franchise are terrifying, the creatures in Silent Hill are built from nightmares and will give you new ones. Silent Hill focuses on the corruption that exists among people and society and examines the evil side of mankind. Many characteristics of humanity are frequently represented and expressed as horrifically unpleasant, antagonistic monsters in Silent Hill. Silent Hill games were developed for those who didn't like action and instead were interested in being confined in a horror-filmed realm. When Resident Evil delved more into action, players were thrilled for the Silent Hill games, which reminded them of the first Resident Evil entries, which prioritized fears over fighting. While later editions have their strengths, the original 3 Silent Hill games are often acknowledged as the greatest. My personal favorite is Silent Hill 2.
Oh, shit! Oh, some shining shit right here.
We're not alone here.
Outlast game franchise. The Outlast franchise is one of the best when it comes to scary games. Both parts of Outlast are fantastic horror games that use their found footage style very well. It incorporates terrifying aspects such as scary sounds, hidden health bars, and darker lighting to immerse viewers in its environment. Despite the difference in gameplay, Outlast overlaps a few elements with Resident Evil, especially the 7th and 8th parts. Of course, two horror games with comparable themes will have some resemblance, but playing these games exposes precisely how similar they are. For example, both the games have corrupt organizations conducting experiments in order to create monsters. The Umbrella Corps from Resident Evil appears to be older, and the Murkoff Corporation from Outlast appears to be more contemporary. Nevertheless, both of their experiments contravene humanity's basic morality and result in tragic catastrophes that the player must avert to rescue a large number of people. The concepts of both the Outlasts are identical. They include reporters exploring dreadful locations that are shrouded in mystery and terror. They'll record the unfolding events before their eyes with a camera as they attempt to flee and survive. As you approach gloomy corners, your camcorder's battery life will not always be 100%. The adversaries range from eerie bipeds to terrifying abominations. The Outlast franchise focuses on making you feel frightened and anxious by a lack of defensive or offensive skills. When you spot a monster, your only option is to flee and hide somewhere before it catches you. And just like Resident Evil, Outlast requires players to skillfully preserve their resources. Both games in the series are good, but Outlast 2 offers superior gameplay and is more frightening than its predecessor, even though the first game's perpetrators are more legendary and probably scarier. To some, Outlast deprives the player of any kind of protection other than fleeing and hiding, leading to some amazing times and some horrible nightmares. Mostly horrible nightmares. The Last of Us game franchise. This gaming franchise has to be the most popular title at the moment, not because of any new game of the franchise, but because of the live-action adaptation of the same name, which recently concluded airing its first season, starring everyone's favorite daddy, Pedro Pascal, and a young and formidable Bella Ramsey, playing the two main characters of the story. This game was developed as the opposite of Resident Evil. The only similar element is the setting, as both worlds are set in a post-apocalyptic world filled with terrifying monsters. Apart from that, both the games are very different in conceptual and gameplay aspects. Resident Evil's USP is its over-the-top horrific characteristics and the variety of enemies. At the same time, The Last of Us is a little deeper, as it makes us question about close relationships and lets us study a father's unconditional love for his child and the magnificent and awful things that may arise from it. The game is set in the post-apocalyptic USA and follows protagonist Joel, a tough guy tormented by the spirits of his past life. He, like many others, gets absorbed by a viral outbreak that transforms individuals into infected entities known as runners. If their scars are not treated, these entities can become ferocious monsters called clickers. In addition, he needs to escort a little girl called Ellie safely across whatever remains of the country to a rebel organization called the Fireflies. There are certain fundamental similarities between The Last of Us and Resident Evil 4. Hear me out. The world of The Last of Us would occur in a setting where Chris, Leon, and their crew from Resident Evil 4 failed to stop the virus from propagating, leaving humanity to fend for themselves against the zombie-like monsters. The Last of Us even has a comparable over-the-shoulder playing design to Resident Evil 4, but it gives players an excellent opportunity to fight and bounce about. Also, Ellie is 10 times more badass than Ashley. To summarize, The Last of Us is an action-adventure game with exciting game mechanics, a well-written emotional plot, and a wonderfully produced environment. What else do you need?
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
Dino Crisis game franchise. Dino Crisis is a clone of Resident Evil, with dinosaurs replacing the zombies. Capcom's Dino Crisis preserves a lot of the aspects that made its zombie genre so appealing. Elements like challenging puzzles, limited inventory space, and tight places are all included and compensated for in the original Dino Crisis, and the dinosaurs provide plenty of exciting confrontations while not being very fearsome. Nevertheless, unlike other Resident Evil clones, Dino Crisis depended on 3D settings rather than pre-rendered backdrops and a stronger emphasis on physical tasks to progress through the game. The plot revolves around a special forces squad led by Special Agent Regina, who must survive inside a top-secret government facility overrun by time-displaced dinosaurs. Regina must battle her way through the facility in order to uncover its mysteries and eventually escape unharmed with her squad. If you like the original Resident Evil game's restricted inventory space and constricted nature, try the first two games of Dino Crisis. While the initial game feels more intimate, the second game is more action-oriented. The sequels were not that good though. The Evil Within 2014. There's a lot in common between Resident Evil and Tango Gameworks' The Evil Within. Both games are created by Shinji Mikami and feature fantastic narratives, horrific imagery, and effective suspense-building treatment. Like Resident Evil, The Evil Within has players consider when to use their weapons as their resources are limited. You'll often be escaping from enemies rather than confronting them. The story of The Evil Within concentrates around a detective called Sebastian Castellanos and his associates, who stumble across a dark and destructive presence while investigating the site of a terrible mass murder. Sebastian is attacked and knocked unconscious after witnessing the murder of his fellow police officers. As he wakes, he finds himself in a surreal world filled with terrible monsters roaming among the dead. The Evil Within mixes stealth and action in the backdrop of a pure survival horror game. Nevertheless, unlike Resident Evil, The Evil Within focuses more on psychological themes than the Resident Evil franchise's experiment gone wrong premise. The game features incredible monster designs that will send chills down your spines. You'll get the impression that someone or something is monitoring you in every location you visit. Anyone searching for an excellent survival horror game like Resident Evil won't be disappointed with The Evil Within. Alone in the Dark. Alone in the Dark is not a clone of Resident Evil. Instead, it's the opposite. Yep, you heard that right. Alone in the Dark is the uncontested godfather of survival horror video games. It was released 4 years before the first Resident Evil game and created survival horror ideas still deployed in games today. Concepts like resource management, riddle solving, escaping from conflicts, and unexpected death traps all exist because of this game. Alone in the Dark used pre-rendered backdrops with three-dimensional polygonal character models overlaid atop. When players moved between rooms, the camera angle and the background changed, revealing a new setting. Although it pales in comparison to current survival horror titles, Alone in the Dark was a huge hit at the time, and the rest of the gaming community took note. The original Resident Evil game borrowed many elements from the first Alone in the Dark game. Both games take place in a haunted house filled with hidden chambers and artifacts, and both require players to solve a series of complex puzzles while evading creatures. Since its debut, Alone in the Dark has seen several sequels and remakes. While not all editions of the game were as well received or adored as the original, that doesn't imply that the horror legend has no place in gaming anymore. Here's some news for you all. A new Alone in the Dark remake is in the works, and it's drawing significant influence from the current Resident Evil remakes. While the main narrative idea will remain the same and comparable events will transpire, this Alone in the Dark reboot is being created from scratch, changing the original game's fixed perspective view to an over-the-shoulder camera angle. That's not it. Based on the footage thus far, this Alone in the Dark reboot is even attempting to emulate the lighting, creature design, and ambiance of the Resident Evil remakes. Hence, although Alone in the Dark may have influenced Resident Evil in the past, Resident Evil is now inspiring Alone in the Dark to grow.
How does it feel to die by the hands of your own creation?
Alan Wake. Alan Wake is an excellent supernatural horror adventure game known for its spooky atmosphere, engaging tale, and exciting episodic structure. Resident Evil 1 and 2 has the same tonality and atmosphere as Alan Wake. They share that sensation of powerlessness as they face overpowering evil forces. Both games take players entirely out of their depth, making them do anything they can to not die while gradually piecing together what's transpired. Alan Wake emulates the formula of Resident Evil 4, emphasizing on the action while yet providing a psychologically terrifying experience for the player. The narrative concerns best-selling suspense novelist Alan Wake as he investigates his wife's vanishing, while both are on holiday in Bright Falls, Washington, where he suffers blackouts and hallucinations of figures and concepts from his current work that he's unable to remember creating coming to life. Darkness plays a vital role in the game. It's not just utilized as a scare technique, but is also woven into the story. Alan Wake's creatures are afraid of light and prefer to live in darkness, creating an ominous mood that fosters a continual sense of foreboding and anxiety. It's a third-person shooter where your primary weapon is a flashlight, as the protagonist isn't an action hero but just a writer. This adds to the excitement and terror. It's a terrific game that keeps the player on their toes at all times. Alien Isolation 2014. Alien Isolation is among those film-adapted video games that exceed fans' expectations. This game captures the same excitement and emotions people love about Ridley Scott's renowned franchise, with its gripping stealth-based gameplay, amazing graphics, and superb sound design. Alien Isolation, like Resident Evil, is adept at making the player feel apprehensive while they navigate their surroundings. While there are times when the player will be given powerful weapons, These moments are extremely rare. Alien Isolation may have predated Resident Evil's primary transition into first-person terrain, but if you liked Resident Evil 7's slow burn terror and thorough exploration, trust me, you'd like to dive into this game. Like Resident Evil 7, Isolation isn't about grand sets and action sequences. Sure, you can inflict more damage in Resident Evil with a limited arsenal of weaponry, but there's still a sense of helplessness when Jack Baker follows you mercilessly. The Xenomorph in Isolation, like Jack, is essentially unstoppable, creating a significant impediment to the player's progress. This game is set 15 years after the original Alien film. It follows protagonist Amanda Ripley, who's curious about what transpired to her mum Ellen Ripley while aboard a mysterious space station. The only issue is that a stray xenomorph has sneaked into this station. Amanda must gather supplies, escape, and hide from the beast before it kills her. Alien Isolation is an excellent discovery for Resident Evil fans, with its exceptional cautionary gameplay and horrifying undertones. Soma, 2015. Soma exposes you to a dark realm at the bottom of the ocean, making it maybe the most severe psychological horror game on our list. This game is for those who like to use their brains, with plenty of involvement, evasion, and puzzle solving. This game is more centered on its narrative than gameplay, thanks to its outstanding voice acting and storytelling. If you liked Resident Evil 7, you would undoubtedly dig Soma, because of the first-person view and horror aspect. Like Resident Evil, Soma's gameplay focuses on stealthy avoidance of enemies, puzzle solving, and physical involvement with the environment. Soma's setting begins on an undersea distant research center with equipment that displays human traits such as awareness. The protagonist, Simon Jarrett, finds himself in the center under unexplained circumstances and sets out to investigate its past while trying to figure out the meaning of his present and prospective future. The game lets you play in a safe mode. The safe mode effectively stops the player from constantly dying at the hands of the game's numerous monsters. On paper, that may seem to be cheating. Nonetheless, it's the most pleasurable approach to playing the game. Soma's goal isn't to startle the player with silly jump scares and unanticipated confrontations with adversaries, but instead, it chooses to really frighten with its terrifying storyline. Soma is a brilliant game that has the player ponder many things throughout its exciting narrative. The end result is a horrifying experience that horror enthusiasts will absolutely enjoy. Tormented Souls, 2021. The 2021 release Tormented Souls represents one of the better instances of how 90s horror romanticism has influenced several projects in recent years. Usually, branding a game as a Resident Evil clone is a criticism, but Tormented Souls embraces the moniker proudly. Tormented Souls tank controls, riddles, inventory management, and backtracking capture the original PlayStation 1 and Resident Evil vibe. The game is essentially the original Resident Evil, redeveloped with a new engine while retaining all the gameplay and design concepts. Gamers take on the character of Caroline, who chooses to examine a dilapidated hospital after being informed about a missing twins case. Inevitably, she's lured into a terrifying environment filled with fascinating monsters fit for a pleasant nightmare. Those who are not big fans of conventional survival horror games may find this game undesirable, mainly because the gameplay can be awkward at times. However, those looking for a callback to the era of 1996's Resident Evil would thoroughly enjoy this 2021 game. BioShock. BioShock is a famous retro-futuristic first-person shooter game that most avid gamers adore. At first appearance, comparing BioShock to Resident Evil may appear to be a reach, but the two games share more in common than you may expect. Even though BioShock is set in a surreal environment, fear is at the center of the experience. Bill Gardner, the primary level designer for 2007's BioShock game, stated how Resident Evil 4 aided him in developing BioShock. At the start of BioShock's development, the team pondered if fans would appreciate a more intricate type of action game. Gardner recalls that the team was encouraged by Resident Evil 4's design and influence to not worry about what the typical player could manage, enabling them to make the gameplay a bit more complicated. The first game takes place in 1960 and follows protagonist Jack as he finds Rapture, an undersea metropolis, created by corporate magnate Andrew Ryan as a secluded wonderland. The city's dramatic downfall occurred following the discovery of Adam, a genetic substance that confers superhuman powers. Jack attempts to flee while fighting Adam-obsessed foes known as Splicers and Big Daddies, while interacting with the few rational humans who remain and understand Rapture's past. Jack may beat his enemies in many ways, including using weapons, plasmids that grant unique abilities, and turning Rapture's defenses against them. BioShock contains a great deal of enjoyable gameplay, pushing you to discover and acquire resources as you progress through Rapture's ecosystem. Like current Resident Evil titles, BioShock excels at environmental narrative, making its environment feel authentic. Parasite Eve 2. Square's Parasite Eve combines role-playing aspects with survival horror to generate a pretty strong mixture. The first game isn't that similar to Resident Evil, but the second game is. Parasite Eve 2 is somewhat divided among the series fans, with much criticism focusing on the game's greater reliance on the Resident Evil brand. The similarity is striking in the narrative and playability of the game. Kenichi Iwao, who also wrote the original Resident Evil, wrote, and directed this game, which explains the similarity between the two titles. Parasite Eve 2 takes place some years after the first game's conclusion. Aya Brea, the previous game's protagonist, becomes entangled in another epidemic of neo-mitochondrial monsters. The first game featured a buddy cop horror narrative about a creature on the loose in New York City. Most of the game focused on a band of individuals attempting to nab it and the probe's impact on them. Yet, compared to Parasite Eve 2's shadow organization developing artificial neo-mitochondria creatures, the consequent subterranean labs, and the small girl plot device personality, it's difficult to deny Resident Evil's narrative inspirations permeated the sequel to a far more considerable extent. The narrative is fast-paced and features a cast of fascinating characters. Ultimately, it's a solid game that did a better job of realizing the promise of its two themes. Fatal Frame game franchise. Fatal Frame, also known as Zero in Japan, is a PlayStation 2 survival horror video game created by Tecmo. The game takes place in 1986, involving siblings Mafuyu and Miku Hinasaki. When Mafuyu suddenly disappears while seeking a famous author at the haunted Humuro mansion, his sister Miku embarks in a quest of finding him. Throughout her journey inside the estate, she obtains clues, battles hostile spirits, and learns the truth about a terrible ceremony that transpired there. The gameplay concentrates on the siblings investigating the mansion and fighting evil spirits with the help of a special camera. There are 3 unique narratives to investigate while playing, each set in a separate historical period. Fatal Frame mirrors the original Resident Evil, as that game is also set in a strange house where you must try to stay alive with scarce resources, solve riddles, and gather objects. Thematically, though, it's far more comparable to Japanese horror film franchises such as Ju-On. Fatal Frame shines out as an excellent survival horror game due to its novel ideas, outstanding sound design, and a great atmosphere to back it up with. If you're tired of the concepts of the undead and the current wave of poor independent horror games, I'd advise you to try Fatal Frame. It's ideal if you enjoy getting scared and want to feel nostalgic. Dead Rising. Capcom is well known for their 2 renowned survival horror games, Resident Evil and Dead Rising. Each of these zombie-slaying escapades shines its own way, yet both offer thrills from zombie hordes and other creatures. While these games have some resemblance, the characters and gameplay style are distinct. Each series is noted for its shock factor, but they use multiple techniques to elicit that emotion. When Resident Evil 4 was released, it influenced the trajectory of the whole franchise. Earlier, tight passages and slow enemies were replaced by vast expanses and charging undead. Keiji Inafune, the creator of Dead Rising, observed this abrupt shift in the franchise and determined that the approach undervalued what made the zombies so horrifying in the first place. This discontent, however, created a new source of inspiration. Dead Rising, which was strongly influenced by classic George A. Romero films such as the Night of the Living Dead franchise, coexisted with Capcom's other successful zombie brand due to the varied ways they presented the undead to the audience. The plot centers upon reporter Frank West, who finds himself trapped in a zombie-infested shopping mall. Frank has 3 days to solve the truth behind the epidemic before a rescue chopper arrives to extract him. Depending on the parameters the player fulfills, the game has several endings. Even though the Dead Rising franchise has dwindled in recent years, there continue to be numerous options to recreate the original game's ambiance. With the successes of the Resident Evil 2 and 3 reboots, there is a resurgence of interest in lethargic zombies from the 1980s, and a Dead Rising sequel may capitalize on this win to back fans' hearts. Left 4 Dead 2008. While there aren't many parallels between Left 4 Dead and Resident Evil regarding gameplay and aesthetics, it's undoubtedly a game for zombie horror fans. Consider it as a shooter variant of Resident Evil 7, Biohazard. The primary goal of this game is to take the fight to the undead and win by battling against them with a 4-person squad. The availability of co-op mode, in which up to 4 individuals may play along, adds to the replay value. In that respect, the game closest to Left 4 Dead from the Resident Evil franchise should be the 5th part. Resident Evil 5 isn't a survival horror game since it leans more on co-op action, elaborating on the action-heavy paradigm of Resident Evil 4. Yet, it remains a thrilling adventure that'll leave you on your feet from the opening scenes to the rolling of the final credits, just like Left 4 Dead. The co-op mode in Left 4 Dead makes you rely on your partners to cover large regions and escape dangerous situations. It simply implies that even if you are an expert with a gun, but your partners are not, you'll be in deep trouble. Collaboration is vital in dealing with more formidable opponents since it requires both of you to remain conscious of your circumstances and adjust to the needs of the hour. The plot is straightforward. Set in the aftermath of a zombie epidemic on the east coast of America, the game puts its 4 heroes, called the Survivors, against waves of the infected. Given the random positioning of hostile zombies, the rhythm of a mission would differ, but it offers a satisfactory ratio of challenge and entertainment. Resident Evil is famous for being goofy and quirky, so if that's your thing, Left 4 Dead is right for you. Deep Fear, 1998. Although the Sega Saturn is a console that's often disregarded, it did generate a few notable and unappreciated titles. Deep Fear, which premiered the same year as Resident Evil 2 and was made of the same horror elements, did precisely that, and accomplished sufficiently to stand out on its own. Deep Fear's gameplay is quite similar to older Resident Evil titles. Several journalists automatically deemed this game as a clone. After all, that's obvious at first sight. However, once you start playing, you'll know how valuable the game's environment is. Deep Fear offered several mechanics that Resident Evil had overlooked at the moment. Players, for example, may fire while moving. In addition, players can use things in real time instead of pushing the start button each time. Moreover, Deep Fear's complex physics of lowering the oxygen supply adds to the overall terrifying experience of the game. The game is set 300 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, in the Big Table Naval Fueling and Research Base. Gamers take on the role of John Mayer, a former SEAL agent who's teamed up with the Emergency Rescue Service, a civilian rescue organization. The player guides John across the Big Table's pre-rendered chambers, which are exhibited from static camera angles utilizing a permanent 3D control mechanism identical to Resident Evil. Several stunning creature designs in the game are inspired by horror and sci-fi themes. Deep Fear has more compelling gameplay than its peers, permitting it to outlive most late 90s games. Admirers of the original Resident Evil should definitely check out this masterpiece.
Help me! Stand up!
Extermination, 2001. Extermination is a survival horror video game released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2. The gameplay mechanics and ambiance resemble Resident Evil's earlier games. The game focuses on Sergeant Dennis Riley of the United States Marine Corps, a Team Red Light member. His team receives a distress signal. The distress signal calls for an urgent airstrike on the top-secret American base in Antarctica. Instead, Team Red Light is dispatched to investigate by C-17, where they encounter the infected. While the storyline and writing in Extermination could have benefited from a little more flair, the game represents a giant theoretical leap in gaming performance that the Resident Evil franchise should have reached a few sequels ago. While comparing the two games, you'll be intrigued to know that Capcom has been satisfied to develop their plot points while leaving the gameplay practically unaltered throughout the series. Extermination, on the other hand, takes an incredibly stale plot and remodels the gameplay enough to render it a significant achievement. While the games appear to be practically indistinguishable at first sight, the concentration on separate areas results in two very similar yet unique products. Ultimately, while it could use a little tweak here and there, it's an excellent first attempt that pumps much-needed blood into an essentially dead genre, or an undead genre. Get it? Anyway, moving on.
Where do you think you're going with my daughter?
Papa?
Cold Fear, 2005. Cold Fear is a 2005 third-person survival horror video game created by Darkworks and distributed by Ubisoft. Cold Fear has only ever existed in the shadow of Resident Evil 4. Several gamers ignored the game since it was perceived as a poor game that came out barely a couple of months following Resident Evil 4. Both games play identically, which suggests that Cold Fear is nothing more than a Resident Evil clone. The game, however, is far more than that. Cold Fear has numerous characteristics that set itself apart from the classic Capcom zombie franchise. franchise. Cold Fear recounts the story of Tom Hansen, a clever young Coast Guardsman, as he uncovers a bizarre Russian whaling vessel after getting a distress call from it. When Hansen investigates the ship, he discovers that mystery parasites are plaguing it and transforming the crew members into mindless zombie-like monsters. Hansen must combat the creatures while exploring the mysteries behind the vessel and its strange inhabitants. The game's premise may sound corny, but its intriguing atmosphere more than compensates for its unimaginative plot. Most Cold Fear takes place on a massive whaling vessel in the middle of the ocean. Waves slam onto the ship's side, tossing it back and forth. The waves can be so violent that they can throw you off balance and plunge you into the ocean. Ultimately, Cold Fear is an underappreciated horror game that can't escape the shadow of Resident Evil 4. It's a pity that both the games happen to come out so close together, as both deserve to be noticed.
Almost did it.
Obscure game franchise. Obscure is a survival horror game that Dreamcatcher Interactive published and Hydrovision Entertainment developed. The plot revolves around 5 senior year pupils from a private high school called Leafmore High, who come across a lab conducting experiments on selected student body members. They aim to find Kenny, their missing friend, alert the school, rescue their teachers, and escape alive. The game draws inspiration from the Resident Evil titles. The plot is a little conventional by today's standards, but it was appropriate for the period. Obscure is a survival horror game where players gather supplies, weapons, and combat creatures. Because the game's creatures are highly allergic to sunlight, during the daytime portion of the game, players may shatter windows to allow in natural light and swiftly kill adversaries. We might not have believed you if you'd told us 18 years back that we'd still be talking about Obscure today. It was a relatively conventional survival horror game at the time, plainly treading in the long-running footsteps of Resident Evil. Today, though, it's a lot simpler to appreciate what Obscure does because it's not that much of a Resident Evil knockoff. After all, you know, apart from the graphics and gameplay. Except for the couch co-op, Obscure isn't a game changer. Yet, it serves as a suitable substitute for those who want to explore games similar to Resident Evil. Clock Tower 3, 2002. Clock Tower 3 is a PlayStation 2 survival horror video game co-produced by Sunsoft and Capcom. It's the 4th edition of the Clock Tower series and was released in 2002. It's also the first and only video game created by Japanese movie director Kinji Fukasaku. The plot revolves around 14-year-old Alyssa Hamilton, who's descended from a bloodline of female warriors who travel across time to vanquish evil spirits. Alyssa goes from 2003 London to the 1940s and 1960s to battle these entities and restore peace to distressed folks. Clock Tower 3 is the first game in the series to offer complete control over the protagonist character, compared to previous games' point-and-click style. During most of the game, Alyssa is provided no weapons and must avoid and hide from her assailants. These foes, referred to as subordinates, are battled after each level, with Alyssa equipped with a longbow. All these factors make the game very similar to Resident Evil, however, calling it a clone would be an overstatement. The game's presentation, which included its magnificent graphics and environment, was praised by critics worldwide. I'd strongly recommend you to give this game a try. Fear game franchise. Craig Hubbard created the first-person shooter psychological horror video game Fear in 2005. When we think about first-person shooters and horror, we tend to think about Resident Evil 7 Biohazard or Resident Evil Village, but Fear does an excellent job of being as original as possible. The first game takes place in the fictional city of Fairport in 2025. It follows the fictional Fear unit, an elite squad in the United States Army assigned to investigate supernatural phenomena as they investigate a private military company's hidden research program. This has resulted in the unintentional release of a hazardous and powerful psychic. The player assumes the position of Point Man, the unit's latest recruit, as he fights not only the psychic but also a dangerous and unpredictable paranormal threat in the guise of a young girl, Ulma Wade. All Fear titles are first-person shooters with a range of firearms, explosives, and game features, the most noteworthy being reflex time, a slow-motion system that enables players to target and fire in real time. You know, just like how Max Payne used to do it. Except for the game Fear 3, each game's campaign is single-player only. Fear 3 is available in single-player and co-op modes. Fear 3 also happens to be the only game that allows the player to select a playable character. The franchise was a big success, particularly the initial game. Some people even believe this game to be one of the finest in this particular style and genre. Talk about a cult status. The supernatural and first-person shooter elements, as well as inventory management, caused gamers to compare this title to the Resident Evil franchise. Yet, in my opinion, there might have been inspirations taken, but Fear feels quite distinct from any Resident Evil game. You'll understand what I mean if you've ever played Fear. If not, what are you waiting for? Metro 2033 2020. Metro 2033 is a first-person shooter survival horror video game released in 2010 by THQ and developed by 4A Games. The story is centered on Dmitry Glukovsky's same-named novel, in which survivors of a nuclear catastrophe seek safety in Moscow's subway tunnels. Gamers take control of Artyom, a guy tasked with saving his hometown station from the evils within the Metro. Players will encounter human and mutant foes throughout the game, who may be eliminated with various weaponry. This game is regarded as one of the better story-driven survival horror experiences. The game follows a similar pattern as Resident Evil Village, although it appeared much earlier. For the better, there's no vast globe to explore. It's a well-designed experience that delivers on its expectations. Like the Resident Evil games, Metro 2033 will have you counting down the number of bullets in your arsenal, as ammunitions are scarce. As a result, killing monsters in this game is tough, but surviving is much more difficult. There are also moral decisions to be made across the game. The player may be able to witness an alternative sequence at the conclusion of the game if they're humane to the folks residing underground, such as offering the homeless certain military-grade weapons. These moral decisions are never openly stated, and finishing the game without being aware of their presence is very much possible. Your appreciation of Metro 2033 is based on your determination to be battered into submission by a game. It expects to be played in a specific manner, and if you're hesitant to match those demands, you'll have a lot of trouble. Such a game is clearly not for everyone. On the other hand, those who can get into it will genuinely enjoy themselves. Condemned. Criminal Origins 2005. Condemned: Criminal Origins is a first-person horror video game that follows the journey of FBI agent Ethan Thomas, who's framed for murder. As he travels to unravel this mystery, he realizes that the corruption of justice goes deep. It may involve the police and other significant parts of the government in some capacity. According to Ethan, a mysterious and secretive organization, the Oro, is somehow involved in this predicament. The game mainly focuses on hand-to-hand combat and intensive exploration to find weapons, kill enemies, and solve puzzles. This game is similar to Resident Evil because of its primary focus on combat and emphasis on puzzle solving and exploration. Both games take place in a dark and eerie environment. The combat in this game is quite intense, and the player has to focus intensely and play with good reflexes. The player can only access primary offensive weapons like pipes, crowbars, and guns. Since ammo is limited, players resort to either fighting with their hands or stealing something from the environment and improvising it as a weapon. The most innovative feature of this game is the forensic investigation system, where a player must analyze crimes and catch killers. This game received positive reviews and did well commercially, and became part of many top 10 and 25 lists. The sound of the game is perhaps its most significant surprise, in a positive way. The situation proved right when a sequel to the game was released 3 years later. Condemned: Criminal Origin is a classic. Siren 2003. Siren is a survival horror stealth video game with an exciting gameplay mechanism called sight jacking, through which players can see through the eyes of their enemies. The player finds him or herself in the remote village of Hanuda, isolated from the rest of the world by a mysterious sea. Located in Hanuda is a dangerous cult called Shibito, who are undead monsters with supernatural abilities. The game's narrative is non-linear, and each character's story arc occurs differently. The consequences of blind faith, the human attraction toward violence, and the fundamental nature of fear have been deeply explored in this game. The similarities of this game to Resident Evil include their use of limited resources like ammo or healing items, forcing the player to strategize very carefully. The puzzle-solving element is also common in both games. Critics praised the game for its innovative gameplay mechanism and engaging narrative. The main criticism of the game was its complicated plot and high difficulty level. The game's level designs were particularly praised for their intricacy and interconnectivity. The stealth aspects of Siren was delightful for gamers. The unique sight-jacking system of the game allows players to track enemies' movements and plan their moves accordingly. 5 years after its original release, Siren was remade. The remake had updated graphics and gameplay mechanics with new characters and plots. Over the years, Siren has gained a cult following and remains popular today. The X-Files. Resist or Serve 2004. The X-Files Resist or Serve is a survival horror game based on the popular TV series The X-Files from 1993 to 2002. The game is set during the show's 7th season as the player investigates mysterious deaths and tries to hunt down ancient alien artifacts, ultimately leading to an alien spaceship in Russia. The narrative and writing of the game were praised, but the graphics and controls were criticized. The game is divided into 3 chapters containing several levels following the plot of the original X-Files story. The first chapter focuses on the sudden loss of power, the second covers a secret military base, while the third involves a zombie outbreak. The X-Files Resist or Serve drew parallels to Resident Evil regarding gameplay, especially the fixed camera angles. The game encouraged investigative gameplay, searching for clues and evidence while scanning the environment. Apart from this, the other dynamics of the game resemble that of a typical survival horror like Resident Evil. Another point of favorable comparison between the two was because of the dark and immersive atmosphere. Overall, the X-Files Resist or Serve became one of the more well-known clones of Resident Evil due to its popularity on television and popular culture. Onimusha Games franchise. Onimusha is an action-adventure video game franchise that blends melee combat with puzzle-solving and exploration elements to create a vast and rich storyline inspired by Japanese history, folklore, and mythology. The first Onimusha game was released in 2001 and was praised for its fast-paced combat and exciting storyline. Several sequels and spin-off titles followed, each game having different protagonists but sharing the overarching theme and gameplay mechanics. One unique feature is the presence of the Oni Gauntlet, which allows the player to absorb the souls of defeated enemies and perform special moves or temporarily transform into a demon. The Onimusha game franchise has been immensely successful, selling over 8.5 million units combined. Onimusha and Resident Evil share survival horror elements and gameplay mechanics, with similar controls and fixed camera angles. The emphasis on narrative and character development is heavy in both franchises. The use of rich cutscenes, high-quality sound design, and voice acting is a staple of both franchises. Onimusha has often been called the ninja version of Resident Evil. Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem 2002. Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem is a psychological horror action-adventure video game with a non-linear narrative and a unique sanity meter influencing overall gameplay. As the sanity meter decreases, the game distorts reality in various ways, like playing mind tricks and making the player think that their saved game progress has been deleted. The player has to take on the role of several characters at different periods, from ancient Rome to the Spanish Inquisition, all of them separate yet only linked by the book Tome of Eternal Darkness. As the player reads through the book, they learn the story of 12 individuals from different timelines who have all encountered ancient evil entities known as the Ancients. The journey of the game lies in uncovering the history of the Ancients, as well as defeating their leader. Eternal Darkness received critical acclaim for its different innovations in both narrative and gameplay. It's often been compared to the Resident Evil franchise for its horror and puzzle-solving elements. Both games have excellent voice acting and sound design. The replayability of both games is relatively high, and both possess robust magic systems. Eternal Darkness manages to outshine Resident Evil in some departments, like the diversity of settings, making it one of the best Resident Evil clones out there. Vampire Hunter D 2000. Vampire Hunter D is a video game based on the light novel series of the same name by Hideyuki Kikuchi. The player assumes the role of a skilled vampire hunter named D, who is half human and half vampire. The first game follows D as he attempts to rescue a young woman from the hands of a mighty vampire. It's a mix of action and exploration, along with puzzle-solving elements. The second Vampire Hunter D game, titled Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, is based on the popular anime movie of the same name. This game was popular among fans, but only a little overall because of its inadequate controls. The game has 3 endings depending upon confident choices and decisions on the player's part. Vampire Hunter D has been favorably compared to the Resident Evil franchise. Both games' dark and foreboding environment has been compared, as have the unique abilities of their protagonists. Both games have complex villains who are not entirely black or white and often elicit sympathy on the player's part. Finally, the science fiction themes of both games, with a particular focus on biological and genetic engineering, also facilitate a natural tendency to compare both franchises. System Shock 2, 1999. System Shock 2 is an action role-playing survival horror video game in the cyberpunk year 2114, when the player wakes up from his cryogenic sleep aboard a starship that aliens are invading. The player must explore the ship and fight off various aliens, from mechanical robots to giant, powerful monsters. The non-linear narrative of the game is presented through audio logs, emails, and other types of conversation.
I'm not sure what's creeping me out worse. The hybrids with their pipes and shotguns, the berserk turrets, or our supposed allies. I don't trust those UNM.
There's also the presence of artificial intelligence in the game, which can act as both an ally and an enemy. The game's advanced physics engine introduces gameplay dynamics like gun recoil. System Shock 2 was initially intended to be a standalone title, but became a successor to the 1994 game System Shock once EA got involved. System Shock 2 was a highly influential game that received critical acclaim, but didn't meet commercial expectations. It's considered one of the best designed games of all time. A spiritual successor of the series called BioShock was released in 2007 to a lot of praise. System Shock 2 has often been favorably compared to games in the Resident Evil series. The atmosphere and tone of both games are very similar. Inventory and limited resource management in both games also draw parallels. The rich stories of both games and the communication of those stories through immersive techniques like audio logs and journal entries also lead to the natural comparison between the two games. Finally, the underlying theme of a genetically modified future runs through the veins of both games. Men in Black, the game, 1998. Men in Black, the game is a third-person action-adventure game based on the popular sci-fi film franchise of the same name. However, the game's plot is different, and the theme is not survival horror, but comedy, as in the movies. The player takes on the role of a recruit in the Men in Black (MIB) organization and helps protect the Earth from various alien forces. The game occurs across New York City, the Arctic, the Amazon, and a remote island. Overall, the game was successful despite its short length and led to the release of future games in the franchise. Men in Black, the game, has often been compared to games in the Resident Evil franchise. The most apparent similarity is the presence of non-human enemies in the form of zombies and aliens. However, the enemy's artificial intelligence in Men in Black is much inferior compared to Resident Evil. The exploration and puzzle-solving elements of both games share strong similarities. The fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds of Men in Black are an instant reminder of Resident Evil. These familiar gameplay mechanics and complex environments make Men in Black seem like a fun and quirky clone of the Resident Evil games. The Crow, City of Angels, 1998. The Crow, City of Angels is an action video game based on the comic book series The Crow. The game follows the story of a man brought back from the dead by a crow and now seeks revenge against the very gang members who had killed him and his son. The game is set in various locations in Los Angeles and is a mixture of third-person shooting and melee combat. The game also has different puzzle-solving elements and a unique ability to summon the Crow, enabling the player to see hidden objects and access otherwise inaccessible areas. The Crow, City of Angels was met with mixed responses and could have done better commercially. Although the game was nowhere near good or successful, The Crow, City of Angels has been considered a Resident Evil clone. The dark atmosphere shared by both games is seen as the beginning of the comparison. The three-layered focus on combat, exploration, and puzzle solving is common in both games. Finally, the overarching theme of revenge and redemption can be seen as the closest link between these two games. Haunting Ground, 2005. Haunting Ground is a survival horror game that follows the story of a young girl who wakes up in a castle with no memory of how she got there. The game has several unique gameplay mechanics apart from conventional exploration and puzzle solving. One salient feature is the presence of a panic meter that measures the character's level of fear and determines how enemies could react. When the panic meter crosses a certain level, the player will slowly start losing control of one's movement. The environment of the castle is complex and confusing, with many hidden rooms and secret passages. The game has various enemies, although combat is not the primary focus. Haunting Ground mainly received good reviews and is a hallmark moment in the creation of game avatars. Haunting Ground has sometimes been favorably compared to some games in the Resident Evil franchise. The chief points of comparison are due to the survival horror elements in both games, which are characterized by terrifying enemies and jump scares. Another central point of similarity is the theme of isolation and horror, where the protagonists in both games find themselves in a world overrun by all sorts of enemies. Overall, Haunting Ground is considered a successful Resident Evil clone. Phase Paradox, 2001. Phase Paradox is a science fiction action game in the distant future where humankind has conquered several planets and is threatened by a mysterious substance called phase matter. The player must survive a series of missions to investigate the source of this phase matter and stop its spread. Depending on the challenge, the player controls technical and combat specialists and can switch between them at any point. There's also an advanced skill tree to customize in great detail. There's also a feature called Time Paradox that allows the player to rewind time and try again. Phase Paradox has often been favorably compared to the Resident Evil franchise for various reasons. One of the main reasons is the ability to control different characters for puzzle solving, exploration, and combat. The sci-fi elements of both games, one being futuristic and the other bio-dystopian, is a standard linker between Phase Paradox and Resident Evil. Perhaps the most exciting similarity between these two is the gameplay difficulty, wherein both games are challenging to master. Overall, Phase Paradox is considered one of the better Resident Evil clones. Overblood, franchise. The Overblood franchise consists of two games, Overblood and Overblood 2. Overblood, initially released in 1997, is a survival horror game chronicling the story of a man named Raz Kasi, who wakes up in a research facility without any memory of who or where he is. There are various puzzle-solving elements through which the player must unravel Raz's past and learn about the sinister experiments taking place at the facility. Overblood 2 is also a survival horror game where a man named Raz Kasi, same name but a different person, is sent to investigate a remote island. This game has much better graphics and gameplay dynamics than the first, but generally involves similar exploration and puzzle-solving elements. Both Overblood games were well received, despite not being as popular as some similar titles. The Overblood franchise has often been favorably compared to the Resident Evil series. Both are quintessentially survival horror games, with an emphasis on exploration and puzzle-solving. Although Resident Evil games are superior in most respects to those in Overblood, the free camera angles in the latter within the 3D environment are considered an improvement over the camera dynamics of Resident Evil. Another common point is the presence of terrifying enemies and the clever use of strategy needed to defeat them. Overall, the Overblood franchise is a successful Resident Evil clone. Kuon, 2004. Kuon is a survival horror game that takes place during the classical 12th century Japanese historical period, where the player plays the role of three characters exploring, fighting, and solving puzzles. The player must explore different areas of the Fujiwara Manor, filled with traps and obstacles that must be avoided and overcome. A wide variety of puzzles must be solved with the correct items that need to be located. Combat is both melee as well as involving magical spells. There are multiple endings to Kuon depending upon the path the player takes. Kuon was well received by critics for its detailed environments and use of traditional Japanese architecture. The controls and gameplay were criticized. The soundtrack of the game also received praise. Kuon remains one of the most expensive PlayStation titles ever made and has gained a cult following. A lot of parallels have been drawn between Kuon and the games of the Resident Evil franchise. Though Kuon remains much lesser known, it still stands out among Resident Evil clones of the time. A dark and dangerous setting is standard in both games. Exploration and puzzle-solving elements are also central to both of the games. The most commonality between Kuon and Resident Evil is the ability to play using various characters. The unsettling atmosphere in both games leads to similar playing experiences. Martian Gothic Unification, 2000. Martian Gothic Unification is a survival horror video game that takes place on Mars in the year 2019. A team of 3 astronauts has been sent to investigate the apparent disappearance of the crew at the Martian base. The group arrives to find that the crew has been turned into zombies. The game focuses heavily on exploration and puzzle solving rather than on combat. One of the unique characteristics of this game is that the 3 members of the team must be kept separated, and it'll be game over should they meet face to face. Players can switch among the 3 characters. Non-dead enemies can't be killed permanently and can only be temporarily incapacitated. Martian Gothic Unification did moderately well and was among several low-budget titles released at the end of the lifespan of the PS1. Martian Gothic Unification shares many similarities with games in the Resident Evil franchise. The third-person perspective, fixed camera angles, and tank controls form the central point of commonality between both games. Another common point is the ability to switch between various characters and multiple endings, depending upon the player's choices. Overall, Martian Gothic Unification is famous as one of the more interesting Resident Evil clones. Mystic Knights, 2005. Mystic Knights is a sci-fi horror action-adventure video game that was exclusive to players in Korea. The game was made by N-Logsoft and involved exploring a research center while fighting various monsters. There's also a 4-player online mode wherein one character is secretly a traitor who tries to stop the progress of the others. The game was praised for its artwork and character design. The online mode received positive feedback, although gameplay became repetitive after a while. Mystic Knights have often been quite favorably compared to Resident Evil because of a similar experience playing both games. However, since it was only released in Korea, Mystic Knights is a seldom known name among the pantheon of Resident Evil clones. Chaos Break, 2000. Chaos Break is a third-person survival horror video game that was the sequel to the arcade-exclusive game Chaos Heat. The game is set in an isolated island's abandoned and contaminated chemical lab. The player can control either of the 2 characters sent to the island to investigate mysterious disappearances. The gameplay is a mix of action, exploration, and puzzle solving. The game bears a striking resemblance to the Resident Evil series. Apart from visual similarities, there are also thematic similarities between Chaos Break and Resident Evil. Another common point is the ability to change characters, allowing for strategic variety. The experience in inventory management is also similar for both games. Overall, Chaos Break is a successful Resident Evil clone.
Hurry! All of you! Get a move!
The City of Lost Children, 1997. The City of Lost Children is an adventure video game based on a French movie of the same name. The game is set in a surreal, dystopian world, and the player takes on the role of a young girl called Miette, who lives in a mysterious city called the City of Lost Children. This city is tormented by an evil scientist named Crank, who's been kidnapping children to steal their dreams in hopes of curing his inability to dream. The player, Miette, must navigate this city, solving puzzles, overcoming obstacles, and rescuing kidnapped children. The game became famous for its sound design, easier difficulty, and boss battles. The City of Lost Children has often been favorably compared to games in the Resident Evil series. Both games share a dark and eerie atmosphere focusing on puzzle solving and exploration. The boss battles in both games also drew particular attention. All in all, the City of Lost Children is one of the oldest clones of Resident Evil. Galerians, 1999. Galerians is a survival horror game that explores the abilities and limits of the human psyche. The protagonist is a young boy, Rion, who has psychic powers and can't remember his original identity. Rion has several psychic abilities, including telepathy and drug-induced offensive powers. Rion has to save humanity by defeating self-replicating artificial intelligence and its genetically enhanced creations. There's no weapon-based combat. All the fighting is psychokinetic. There's a special meter that, when complete, throws Rion into an uncontrolled rage that instantly kills any non-boss enemy. But this state harms Rion himself if he stays in it for too long. The game was successful and received mixed reviews. The pre-rendered 3D graphics, as well as the dark, twisted plot, was praised. The cutscenes were called movie-like. The linearity in the field and complex controls were criticized, but the overall intention of the game was honored and constituted something different in the survival horror genre. Galerians is often compared to the Resident Evil series and is considered a high-fidelity clone. Covert Ops Nuclear Dawn, 2000. Covert Ops Nuclear Dawn is a survival horror first-person shooter video game whose story revolves around Jack Morton, the sole survivor of a terrorist attack on a train carrying a nuclear warhead. The game aims to secure the warhead before enemy forces get a hold of it. Puzzle solving is a central component of this game. Covert Ops Nuclear Dawn has often been favorably compared to the Resident Evil franchise, especially using pre-rendered backgrounds. Using strategy is also paramount in both games, as players often find themselves outnumbered and outweaponed. There are also many common stealth elements in both games. Overall, Covert Ops Nuclear Dawn is a successful Resident Evil clone. Soul of the Samurai, 1999. Soul of the Samurai is an action-adventure video game set in feudal Japan. It follows the journey of a young warrior, samurai or ninja, depending on gender, as they learn the ways of combat and seek to uphold the ideals of the Bushido Code. The game's combat system is quite detailed, and once mastered, it's a lot of fun to dispatch multiple enemies at once coming from different directions. Soul of the Samurai has often been described as a samurai Resident Evil restricted to close combat weapons. It's also been compared to the Silent Hill franchise. There are many aesthetic similarities between this game to Resident Evil. The depth of combat in both games has been praised. Soul of the Samurai was well received and became a genre-defining game, especially in samurai horror. It and Onimusha established the standard for future games in this trendy subgenre. Overall, Soul of the Samurai is a successful Resident Evil clone while retaining its soul. Blue Stinger, 1999. Blue Stinger is an action-adventure video game on an isolated island called Dinosaur Island, inhabited by mysterious creatures. The player takes on the role of either of the two protagonists, as they must navigate the island and unravel the mystery behind the strange creatures of the island and their purpose. Blue Stinger's unique art style and design, its sci-fi feeling, and well-developed characters made it successful. Not so much in Japan, but hugely in America. The emphasis on exploration and puzzle solving is something that Blue Stinger and Resident Evil share. Combat is also essential. While Blue Stinger's combat is more action-based, Resident Evil's is strategy-based. Finally, both games feature a strong narrative, making Blue Stinger a great Resident Evil clone. Dark Wood, 2017. Dark Wood is a survival horror video game that takes place in a mysterious forest and follows the story of the player who must survive the forest and unravel its secrets while overcoming various obstacles in the form of monsters. There's a detailed survival gameplay mechanic. Players have to manage their hunger, thirst, and fatigue. There's also a day-night cycle, and players can either avoid or face various monsters. Dark Wood is aesthetically quite similar to Resident Evil, and both feature a tense atmosphere and a looming sense of dread where danger could lurk lurk at any corner. There's also a wide variety of puzzles, enemies in both games, detailed gameplay mechanics for survival, and even stealth. Finally, both games' art and sound design is highly immersive and on the same level. Darkwood shouldn't be called a Resident Evil clone, but should be said to be inspired by the game.
Quick! Water! Water!
Countdown Vampires, 1999. Countdown Vampires is a survival horror game where the player must assume the role of a homicide detective who must escape a new horror-themed casino after everyone spontaneously turns into vampires. The gameplay of Countdown Vampires is quite similar to the Resident Evil and Silent Hill franchises. There are various monsters, some inspired by the Resident Evil series. The game has multiple endings, depending on how quickly it's completed. The game has been praised for its atmospheric setting. The most salient level of similarity the game has with Resident Evil is through the use of fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds, creating a sense of claustrophobia. The puzzle-solving elements of both games are similar, as are the types of enemies. Overall, Countdown Vampires can be called faithful clones of Resident Evil. Nocturne, 1999. Nocturne is an action-adventure survival horror video game set during the 1920s and 30s. For example, during the Prohibition and Great Depression eras, the player assumes the role of an operative sent by President Theodore Roosevelt to fight all sorts of mysterious monsters like werewolves, zombies, and vampires. Nocturne's similarity with Resident Evil starts with the dramatic use of camera angles. Still, it differs in its use of 360-degree aiming with the mouse, which was unlike any other game of its time, and allowed a high degree of free aiming. Like Resident Evil, it features a pre-rendered background superimposed with 3D characters. Nocturne received great reviews and won many awards. Nocturne has also influenced many future games in the survival horror genre. Overall, Nocturne is one of the better clones of Resident Evil, although it can hold its own on some gameplay dynamics. Curse: The Eye of Isis, 2003. Curse: The Eye of Isis is a survival horror video game that shares the same ambiance, gameplay dynamics, camera angles, and general mechanics as the game of the Resident Evil franchise. A curse has been unleashed after a group of thieves stole the Eye of Isis, an ancient Egyptian artifact, from the Museum of Natural History in Great Britain. The player is responsible for breaking the curse and saving the museum from destruction. Curse: The Eye of Isis is often called a budget Resident Evil. The puzzle-solving elements and limited inventory share similarities with the Resident Evil series games. Both games utilize fear and horror to create an immersive and tense atmosphere. Resident Evil is much more widely spread, while Curse: The Eye of Isis takes place in a limited geography. Overall, this game is a decent clone of Resident Evil. Carrier, 2000. Carrier is a survival horror video game entirely in 3D, which was quite rare at the time for games of that genre, which usually displayed 3D characters over pre-rendered backgrounds. The gameplay has been praised, with notable similarities to other survival horror games and its small innovations. The 3D directional controls in the game were one of the most exciting features. The player assumes existence in a world where the Northern Hemisphere has prospered much more than its southern counterpart, and a war is waged between them. The player crash lands on a ship and has to navigate from there, unraveling whatever lies ahead. The narrative of Carrier has been praised as being very engaging and well written. The graphics and sound design were also quite notable. The puzzle-solving elements of Carrier have been compared to that of the games of Resident Evil. Both games' immersive, isolated, and spooky ambience has been compared favorably. Overall, Carrier is one of the better clones of Resident Evil with its little innovative touches. Rule of Rose, 2006. Rule of Rose is a survival horror game set in England in the 1930s, following the story of a young girl named Jennifer who finds herself in a strange orphanage run by a group of sadistic women. The main gameplay involves exploration, puzzle solving, and combat. Although combat isn't the game's primary focus, there are many options for improvising weapons. Stealth is also a vital element of the game. This game was controversial because of its depiction of violence and sexuality. Apart from Resident Evil, the game has been compared to Silent Hill and Haunting Ground due to the elements of psychological horror involved. Rule of Rose and Resident Evil share many aesthetic and gameplay similarities. The puzzle-solving elements, as are the types of enemies and inventory management, are similar. Both games have a strong narrative and deeply immersive atmosphere, however dark and haunting. Overall, Rule of Rose was one of the more exciting clones of Resident Evil. Due to the limited number of copies published, this game is relatively hard to find. Fear Effect 2: Retro Helix, 2001. Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix is an action-adventure video game from the third-person perspective. It's set in Hong Kong in 2048, with a global pandemic and crime. The story follows two female protagonists in their mission and effort to save the world. There are 4 playable characters at different points during the game. Various weapons are available, but the game relies mainly on a puzzle-solving mechanic. There are 2 endings, one good and one bad, based on the player's ability to solve a critical puzzle. Fear Effect 2 Retro Helix received favorable reviews upon release. The bond between the principal characters, as well as the 3D controls, was widely praised. The difficulty in solving some of the puzzles drew both likes and dislikes among critics and gamers. A sequel was announced but then cancelled. This resulted in a wide-ranging crowdfunding campaign that ultimately led to the development of a true sequel called Fear Effect Sedna, released in 2016. A one-off comic book was also released and became immensely popular. Fear Effect 2, Retro Helix, and Resident Evil are similar in their dark ambiance and a strong emphasis on storytelling and creating a deeply immersive atmosphere. The camera angle system in both games is similar, as are the types of enemies and inventory management. Overall, Fear Effect 2, Retro Helix became a success in its own right. The Ring, Terror's Realm, 2000. The Ring, Terror's Realm is a survival horror game based on the Japanese novel and movie called Ring. This game features similar mechanics to other survival horror games of the time, including Resident Evil. The puzzle-solving elements are similar to Resident Evil, as is the tense third-person fixed camera perspective. Like Resident Evil, The Ring features a variety of enemies, from ghosts and zombies to supernatural entities. The game's plot involves the player being trapped inside the Center for Disease Control, CDC, and trying to figure out what caused the mysterious deaths of the player's colleagues. The game's graphics are dated by today's standards, but were impressive for the time. The game could have garnered more appreciation, although its immersive ambiance and sound design were praised. The isolated and spooky environment also drew parallels to Resident Evil. The Ring, Terror's Realm thus holds its place as a decent clone of Resident Evil and other generic survival horror games. Kudelka, 1999. Kudelka is a survival horror role-playing game in a monastery setting, where the player must uncover dark secrets and battle terrifying monsters. The combat is turn-based, while the game's main themes are explorative adventure and puzzle-solving. Kudelka was critically praised but only moderately successful commercially. The graphics, cutscenes, and overall dark cinematic nature of the game were praised. The chief point of criticism was the slow pace of the game. There's a lot of extremely high-quality motion capture and CGI in the film that was the cutting-edge limit of technology of the time. The game inspired the creation of a popular manga. A direct sequel was planned but was never realized. However, the game became the spiritual predecessor and inspiration of the popular Shadow Hearts series, which is set in the same universe as this game. The puzzle-solving elements of Kudelka drew parallels to the games in the Resident Evil franchise. Inventory, health, and ammunition management also share the same structure in both games. The fixed camera angles also drew comparisons. Overall, the difficulty of playing and the richness of the narrative of both games caused Kudelka to be called a clone of Resident Evil, although it can hold its own due to its few innovations. Galerians Ash, 2002. Galerians Ash is a survival horror game featuring a mix of horror and action with a strong emphasis on narrative. The game follows the story of a young man with psychic powers being hunted down by a mysterious organization. There are various sorts of psychic abilities in gameplay, like telekinesis, pyrokinesis, and electrokinesis. The game's story is complex, with themes like betrayal, corruption, and revenge. Galerians Ash and Resident Evil share similarities in combat and puzzle-solving elements. This game also employs tank controls that draw parallels to Resident Evil and other games in this subgenre. The best point of similarity is both games' dark and tense atmosphere, creating a sense of tension and unease, both set in a semi-dystopian setting. Overall, Galerians Ash is a memorable game in the survival horror genre that can be labeled a semi-clone of Resident Evil.
Michelle.
Hard Edge, 1998. Hard Edge is a survival horror game set in a futuristic world and features a mix of survival horror and action gameplay elements. There are multiple playable characters that the player can switch between. The game featured detailed character models and an immersive dark atmosphere. The story of the game is rich with quite complex themes. The plot involves infiltrating a building captured by terrorists who have an important hostage. The gameplay of Hard Edge has been compared to Resident Evil, firstly in terms of 3D characters moving across pre-rendered backgrounds. accounts. The third-person perspective and puzzle-solving elements of both games share many similarities. There's also a similarity in the presence of a crafting system, allowing new items to be created by combining materials available in both games. Overall, Hard Edge is a little-known but fun and immersive clone of Resident Evil. Marvelous verdict. Resident Evil is an iconic game franchise that's been significant for the gaming and movie industries. Resident Evil is credited with having established and defined various standardized elements of the survival horror genre in terms of its formula for puzzle solving, horror, inventory, health, and ammunition management. The franchise has strongly affected pop culture, with its films grossing over $1.2 billion worldwide. Its characters and monsters have become iconic symbols of horror. The Resident Evil franchise has also kept up with technological innovation at every level by introducing new features with the rollout of newer video game consoles. The cultural impact of the franchise has been tremendous, and on the commercial side, it's one of the best-selling video franchises of all time, selling over 135 million copies worldwide. Resident Evil has always pushed the boundaries and remained relevant, generating a dedicated fan base who are incredibly excited to launch the Resident Evil 4 remake on the 24th of March, 2023. This should be epic. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.